Please forgive me if I stutter, hesitate, or mispronounce anything while reading this work, and for any noises in the background. Same content warnings as the last times. This is Chapter 4, Part 4 of Passerine. Tubbo stood in the knee-deep waters of the river that cut through the valley. Once clear, it now ran with blood. Friend or foe, it didn't seem to matter. They all bled the same, the river's current tugging at him. It was all right, it seemed to say. You can let go now. And Tubbo wanted to. By gods, he wanted to, more than anything. His quiver was empty of arrows. He'd lost his bow and sword to the chaos, and all he had was a dagger, its blade no longer than his hands and just as frail. His body felt like it had been fighting for weeks, but a glance at the sun high overhead told him it had only been hours. Hours of senselessly slaughtering his way down through the fray. It was better when he still had arrows, when he could stand and shoot at distant enemies without thinking of them as people, when he'd retorted to using a sword, when he'd gotten close enough to see the fear in their eyes as the blade pierced through the cloth and skin, when the blood had colored him crimson. It was suddenly frighteningly real. Once he had wanted to see their enemies burn. Now he wanted it to be over. Tubbo looked up at the sound of shouting. Before him, enemies were running through the wall of flames, cutting through the fire like one after the other in an unending tide. The words "reinforcements" and "too many" and "retreat" echoed in Tubbo's ears as the breath was knocked out of him. He tightened his grip on the dagger as the enemy reinforcements advanced, cutting down people who were too weak, too inexperienced, too tired to fight. People like Tubbo. They drew closer, an infinite army. Tubbo felt bile rise in his throat. Too many, too many, too many. He felt hot tears slipping down his cheeks. Too many, too many. He felt his fear and dread like a physical weight, almost driving him to his knees. Too many. In the end, Tubbo was not a hero, but he raised his dagger anyway. "It's over," Tommy whispered. He leaned against his brother as they both looked over the valley, as the enemies descending upon their army like a swarm of hawks. The pain in his shoulder was now a distant worry. It wouldn't kill him, but he knew death was coming for him regardless. "We're fricked." Wilbur was still. "Wilbur," Tommy turned to his brother. You know I love you, right?" The king gave a sharp look. "What in the world are you talking about?" Tommy swallowed thickly, trying and failing to keep the tears in. I love you. I don't think I ever said it, but it's true. I figured, if it's my last chance." "This is not your last chance," Wilbur snapped, his eyes darkening. He whirled around, facing Technoblade, who still stood between them and the mysterious soldier. Techno! Techno glanced back at Wilbur, his expression shuddered. He did not look to Tommy. "It's time," Wilbur called out. For a moment Techno only stared, and then slowly, deliberately, he nodded. "I'm sorry, Wilbur." "What?" Tommy demanded. "What are you talking about?" Wilbur did not reply. He wasn't even listening. Tommy could only watch as Wilbur unhooked a blowing horn from his side. He put it up to his lips, and mechanically, his eyes blank and staring at nothing at all. "Wilbur?" Tommy begged. "Wilbur, what's going?" Wilbur blew the horn. She heard it. They all did. Hearts snapped up at the sound of the war horn echoing through the valley. A low, sad sound like the beginnings of a funeral dirge, or the cry of a lone bird separated from its flock. The flower shopkeeper met the eyes of a woman across the field, a stranger, only familiar from brief, inconsequential meetings in the camp. But in that moment, they were kindred spirits, united in their determination. The shopkeeper nodded. The woman gave her a solemn salute. It was now or never. The shopkeeper glanced at the oncoming horde of enemies, butchering all that stood in their way. But the royal army was not fighting anymore. They were running. They threw down their weapons and ran back in the direction of the hill, stumbling over weeds and irises and vines of morning glories. The green army, outnumbering them 10-1, gave chase, unaware of what was coming. The shopkeeper took off, the rock in her pocket seeming to grow heavier with every step. But unlike the others, she was headed north, up one of the craggy mountains that bordered the valley. She knew the others, at least those who weren't dead already, must be headed towards the other mountain, crashing through the trees and underbush as she was. There was 50 of them in total, but only 2 of them were really needed for the job. "If you lose heart," the king had said during the midnight meeting where he had laid out his plans to the volunteers, "just make sure someone else still has theirs. This is a last resort, but it might be our only chance." He told them all they were free to leave. None of them had. The rest of the camp had all been told two things: when you hear the horn, run for your life, and don't tell Prince Tommy. The shopkeeper bounded over boulders and overgrowth, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Hey! She risked a glance back and found 3 Green Army soldiers running after her. They were less used to the terrain than she was. She'd walked this path 1,000,000 times over the past week, but they were gaining on her quick, their swords raised and ready. The shopkeeper kept running, but her knees were screaming, her lungs on the verge of collapse. She was tired, so tired. A yell came from behind her. She tried to ignore it until it came again. She glanced behind her once more, stopping dead in her tracks when she realized what was happening. One of the enemy soldiers was on the ground, a small dagger embedded in the nape of his neck, and the other 2 were doubling back, facing the attacker that must have followed them up into the forest. She caught sight of brown hair, a small frame. Oh, gods! It was that boy who'd lied his way into the army, and had fought bravely in it until the very end. The shopkeeper glanced behind her, to the cave where her main objective was. She was so close, but the boy, she saw, was unarmed. The decision was already made. She ran back down the mountain, her axe in her hand. The soldiers had cornered the boy against a tree, their blades ready to cut his life at 17 years, but that meant that their backs were to her, and they never saw her coming. Just pretend you're chopping down a tree, the general had taught them during their training phase at the castle. The axe will get the job done, but it'll take a few swings. It only took her 2, one through the neck and the other into the skull. The 2 soldiers dropped dead at her feet. The boy stared up at her, breathing heavily, his face streaked with blood and dirt. It looked as if he had aged 50 years in a day. The shopkeeper no longer recognized the young, foolhardy boy who'd run around camp doing the most minimal chores, grinning from ear to ear, taking pride in being part of something bigger than himself. He was bathed, battered and bruised and bleeding. With eyes so haunted, the shopkeeper couldn't help but wonder about all the things he'd seen since the sun rose over the battlefield. What has the world done to you? She thought, but all she said was, "Are you all right?" The boy could only nod, wordlessly. "You need to get out of here," she said hurriedly, already hearing more soldiers coming up the mountain. "Here, take this." She shoved her axe in his hands. The boy shook his head vigorously. "I can't," he croaked. "You need it to protect yourself." She gave him a bitter smile. "Trust me, kid, you need it more than I do. Now go. You know your orders. Back to the camp. Follow the sun." Before she could think better of it, she pulled the boy into her arms, hugging him tightly. For a moment, he could only stand in lifeless surprise, and then she felt his arms close around her. He buried his head into her shoulder and let out a single gut-wrenching sob. When the shopkeeper let go, there was a new spark in the boy's eyes, faint but better than nothing. The boy turned to go, but lingered at the tree line. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nicky," she said. "My name is Nicky." "I'll see you later, Nicky," the boy said, and was gone. She stared after him for a while, her heart feeling lighter in a way she could not explain. But then a twig broke in the distance, heralding the arrival of enemy troops. The shopkeeper steeled herself one last time and headed for the cave. Inside, stacked from one end of the cave to another, connected to neutral underground caverns that ran the length of the mountain, was the king's last resort, the only thing that stood between their kingdom and the certain doom. "We will see our enemies burning," the king had promised them on that first day, lifetimes ago. It wasn't exactly burning, but blowing them to kingdom come was an acceptable compromise. The flint was in her hand. All she could smell was sulfur, and the distant scent of the irises. Her pursuers were at the mouth of the cave, screaming as they realized what she was about to do. They might have begged. She would never know. "I'll see you all in hell," she said bitterly, and struck the flint into flame. At the summit of the opposite mountain, in a cave almost identical, the captain did the same. "For my kingdom," she whispered to the empty cave, and let the fire fall. Nicky hoped, at the very least, that they would plant the prettiest flowers over her grave. The explosions rocketed the world. It rattled the very sun from its loyal orbit. Wilbur braced himself against a rock he'd once stood fearlessly on and watched the mountains fall. Yes, the voices chorused, this was always meant to be. Wilbur had been there before. He'd dreamt it, he'd lived it, as an avalanche of rocks and earth cascaded into the valley, crushing everyone unfortunate enough to be left behind, friend or foe. Wilbur felt a tug of familiarity at his core, his ears rung from the violence of it all. The voices, the screaming, the blast that went on and on and on. Flocks of birds soared up in the sky, disturbed from their perches. They were the only survivors. When the dust settled, all Wilbur could see was a pile of devastation where the Blue Valley used to be, their enemies crushed by thousands or buried alive on Wilbur's orders, and their allies. Wilbur bent over to the ground and vomited. Wilbur! Wilbur's ears were still ringing. He heaved the last of his stomach's contents, coughing up blood and spittle. There was no end to it. Wilbur! Wilbur turned, almost afraid of what he would find behind him. Tommy, his face pale, his eyes wide and staring, as if he'd never seen Wilbur before. Tommy, Wilbur croaked. Stop looking at me like that. Look away, look away, look away. What? Tommy's voice was small. What the frick did you just do? What the frick did he do? The war god demanded. He tried moving towards the king and the prince, but Techno was there, forever blocking his way. Don't take another step. Techno raised his trident, its prongs aimed towards the war god's chest. Your army is gone. There is nothing left to fight for. You jerk, the god growled, his obsidian sword trembling in his grip. You think this hurts me? I died years ago. Techno took a deep breath, his hands still reeking of sulfur. Come then, he said, exhaustedly. Blood for the blood god. I shall kill you again. The war god jumped towards him, starting the cycle anew. You said no more secrets. Tommy's nails dug bloody crescents in his palms. You promised, Wilbur. They were all dead. They were all dead, because of the man that Tommy couldn't bear to call his brother. He wanted to dig into his skin and rip out every part that was Wilbur's. He wanted to gut himself, tear it all apart from the inside out. If that was what it took to get rid of the screaming in his head. Wilbur wasn't meeting his eyes. Tommy marched up to him and grabbed him roughly by the collar. Frickin' look at me, you piece of shirt! Tommy screamed. The ground was still shaking. Or maybe it was just him. Hot tears spilled down his cheeks, tears of rage too big for his body. How long have you been planning this? Was it from the beginning? Did you look our people in the eyes and never bother telling them you were leading them to the slaughterhouse? Some of them had to have survived, Wilbur whispered, his words almost lost in the winds. I warned them. Tommy shook him violently. That's not the freaking point, he sobbed. Wilbur finally looked at him, but there was nothing behind his dark eyes. I did what I had to do, Tommy, was all he said. Tommy shoved him viciously away. His hands felt dirt. He felt unclean. His head, he could still hear the strings of a lonely guitar playing over the soft laughter of soldiers that were now simply gone. Gone in a flash, between one breath and the next. It had come so easily to Wilbur. Would it come easily to Tommy, too? You fricked up, Tommy spat. You fricked up, Wilbur. Tommy. Wilbur reached out to him, but Tommy flinched back. Don't frickin' touch me. In battle, when two opponents were evenly matched in strength and wisdom and anger, it would only take one thing to bring it all down. One soldier, one mistake, one move. The war god had seen his fair share of battles, and had won all of them, except one. The only battle to matter, and he'd lost everything, because of the blood god had decided to throw his lot in with the opposing forces. One soldier. Afterwards, the war god had dragged himself through the battlefield, his throat burning from screaming his lover's name into the quiet sky. When he'd found him, the war god had crawled towards the broken body, curling around it as if he could somehow warm it back to life, and he had stayed there for years, letting the moss and the weeds grow over the two of them. He would have stayed there forever. Besides, the carcass rotted down to the bones, but a fire had grown inside of him, a fire that would not be satiated until he had the head of the god that had taken everything from him. Now here he was, facing off against the very culprit. It was a bloody dance. The war god slashed and the blood god parried. The blood god lunged and the war god ducked, like the push and pull of the tides, drawn to each other by gravity of violence. But all the war god needed, he knew, was a single chance. He would not waste it. Don't frickin' touch me! The words were the high-pitched shriek of a frightened child, a familiar sound on a battlefield, indistinguishable from every scream that came before it. But the blood god turned towards it, leaving his defenses completely open. One mistake. The war god raised his sword high above his head. It was very difficult to kill a god, but not impossible. In the right hands, like the hands of a warrior with the fire in his heart and the carnage in his smile, it would only take one blow. Goodbye, blood god, he thought. My vengeance is complete. Technoblade turned instinctively at Tommy's scream, just in time to see Tommy draw back from Wilbur's reaching hands. Pain flashed across Wilbur's face, but he was otherwise unscathed. Both of them were safe, no knives in their backs, no arrows through their throat. A shadow fell over Technoblade, and by the time he remembered where he was, it was too late. Techno turned and faced the tip of a bloody sword, a breath away from his face, but it was not the war god's obsidian blade coming to reap his soul. It was a familiar silver broadsword, piercing right through the war god's chest. Technoblade could only stare at the war god, look down at the blade embedded straight through his heart, his sword arm still raised in what would have been a killing blow. Instead, the obsidian sword fell harmlessly out of his limp hold and onto the dirt, and the war god followed close behind. Behind him stood a winged man, his golden hair catching the rays of the setting sun. No, the voices screamed. Not you, not you, not you. Hello, Techno, said Philza. Wilbur saw him first. Perhaps that was how it was always meant to be. Some part of him would always, unfailingly, be looking for him. Tommy followed a beat later. Wilbur saw his brother's shoulders go slack, like a marionette with its strength suddenly cut. Dad? Their father was standing before Techno and the unmoving body of a white-cloaked soldier. At the sound of Tommy's voice he turned and looked at his sons for the first time in a decade. And so enters the scene once more, the voices whispered, and before Wilbur could say anything, Tommy was already running. One move was all it would take. On the ground beside him was one of the blood god's throwing knives, lost during their battle. With the last of his strength, he curled his fingers around the hilt. His love was calling him home. He could hear it in the warm wind, but he could not face him before he was avenged. And so with all he had left, the war god aimed and he threw. Dad! His father was here. His dad, standing among the blue irises, the same shade as his sad eyes. The years fell away like smoke, and Tommy was a boy again. There was no explosion, there was no war, there was no leaving, there was only a son and his father. Tommy felt a hysterical laugh bubble out of him as he ran, even as his cheeks still stung with tears. There was everything. There was confusion, there was grief, there was anger, and there was relief. There was disbelief, there was joy. Dad! Tommy shouted, spreading his arms wide as he ran, like a bird about to take flight. Tommy. Dad's smile was still the same. After all these years, he opened his arms, welcoming Tommy into embrace. My boy, you've grown so much. And then there was pain, and the knife found its mark in the prince's heart. Techno watched Tommy fall backwards, impossibly slow. It took a moment for the reality to sink in, and by then, Wilbur was screaming so loud it drowned out everything else, even the voices that began screeching inside Techno's head. Tommy! Philza shouted, running towards Tommy's unmoving body, but Wilbur was already there, cradling his brother to his chest. Techno could only watch, utterly numb, utterly cold, utterly lost inside his own head. No, 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 no. This couldn't be happening. This could not be happening. It was over. The war was over. He'd done everything he could to protect them. That is what it feels, someone gasped. To lose everything. By the time Techno turned towards the war god, ready to rip him limb from frickin' limb, he was dead, a smile on his face. Frick you, Techno thought furiously. Frick you, frick you, frick you! Techno, Wilbur's scream brought him violently back to his body, and the force of the comets crashing into the earth. Help me! Techno staggered towards him, his blood as heavy as lead, his vision lazy, but he could still see one thing that mattered. His Tommy, lying still, so still in his brother's arms. His Tommy, who braided his hair with sweet-smelling flowers. His Tommy, who was quick to anger but quicker to laugh. His Tommy. The sun was setting over the blue valley. There was a terrible, terrible silence, the kind of silence that always came before something devastating. The calm before the storm. Tommy had always hated silences. It gave his mind too many spaces to fill with darkness, so he brought light. Instead, noise and laughter and jokes and jibes, anything to keep the quiet at bay. Wilbur had helped with the weight, like he'd promised, but now it was back, pressing against Tommy's chest, suffocating him under its burden. There was pain, so much pain. He thought he had already felt pain, but what did he truly know? He was only 15. Tommy felt himself be lifted into someone's arms, the arms of the man that had snuffed out the lives of 2 armies in one fell swoop. Tommy wanted to push him away again, to spit his anger out and his disgust, but he was too weak to do either. He could only lie there, staring up at his brother's face, twisted with anguish. His mouth was moving, speaking words Tommy could barely hear. "Let me go," Tommy wanted to say. "Give me back to the ground." And then Wilbur started humming. It was a song, the song Tommy had been humming just this morning, lifetimes ago. "What?" Tommy breathed, the rest of the question dying on his lips. He couldn't keep his eyes open. He knew he should, because otherwise he'd be... "Your lullaby," Wilbur sobbed, his tears hitting Tommy's cheeks. "It's the lullaby I used to play for you on my guitar when you were younger." And just like that, everything came before was forgiven and forgotten and gone. But was that such a bad thing? Rest would be nice. If it meant his lungs would stop hurting, if it meant that his chest would stop aching. Sleep was good. Sleep was... "I miss your music, Wilbur." Tommy could feel someone stroking back his hair so gently, so lovingly. "Keep your eyes open, Tommy." Techno. "Keep your God's darn eyes open." Bad. He needed to keep awake. Techno was telling him to, and Tommy always did what Techno said, because Techno was his tutor, his teacher, his big brother. "I would have..." Tommy coughed. He felt blood tickle down his jaw and then nothing at all. "I would have liked to hear you play it together again." Wilbur's hold on him tightened. Somewhere far away, someone was screaming for a medic. And Tommy knew it was. "We'll play for you," Techno vowed. "When we get home, we'll play for you as many times as you want, Tommy. I'll let you beat me when we spar. I'll let you braid my hair, or even cut it all off if you want to. Anything you want. Just keep your eyes open." A shadow fell over them, in the shape of wings that Tommy had only seen once before, when he had flown out of Tommy's bedroom window, and out of their lives forever. Or not forever. Tommy tried to raise his head to see his father's face, but the pain was too much. "Dad," Tommy whispered. He still wanted to do so much. He still wanted to scream at Wilbur and then embrace him. He still wanted to find flowers for Techno's hair. He still wanted to go home, to the kingdom that they had protected. He still wanted to hug his dad. But a darkness was quickly gathering. "Tommy?" Tommy had no idea who had said his name. It all sounded so very far away. "Don't leave me," Tommy begged. "Please, I'm so scared." "We're here, Tommy." A kiss on his forehead. Someone holding his hand. Strong arms around him. Wilbur humming his old lullaby. Warm, or even dark. "We'll always be here." Too late. "Thank you," Tommy breathed. "Thank you, He had so much left to say, so much left to offer. Love, forgiveness, cheer. But he would leave it there, until he woke up again. Tommy's eyes drifted shut. His mother's laughter had never sounded clearer. Somewhere in the distance, the green god began to smile.